I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 17, Operation Spartan. Fort Carson, Colorado, Butts Army Airfield. For over an hour, all Staff Sergeant Riker had heard was the constant takeoff and landing of attack helicopters and the sonic booms of fighters overhead. It was 0230 hours, and his squad of soldiers sat in a line outside the hangar in the morning darkness, their rucks next to their bodies. His men had their faces painted, their equipment double-checked, rifles clean and ready to roll. Now it was time to do what the Army did best: hurry up and wait. Riker's unit, the 1st Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment, was going to assault the Walsenburg Golf Course, just west of their primary objective. The small town of Walsenburg would place them 32 kilometers behind the front lines, and was being used as a headquarters and logistical hub for many of the PLA brigades and divisions that were fighting it out with the Americans near Colorado City. Riker's battalion had been given the task of capturing the various headquarters units. If possible, they were also directed to seize the city before the PLA could send reinforcements. His platoon had been tasked with securing the landing zones on the golf course for the battalion. His group would be the first ones to land, which was an honor but also scary as hell, since they'd be on their own until more units arrived. While 1st Battalion assaulted the city, their sister battalions in their brigade would be ferried in to help reinforce their positions. The other 2 brigades would be dropped into the mountain ridges to the southwest of the city to further secure Interstate 25, a critical logistical lifeline for the PLA. In preparation for this assault, the Air Force had dispatched 2 full squadrons of F-16 Vipers to specifically go after and eliminate any air defense systems near the landing zones. While the Vipers went to work on suppressing the enemy SAM sites, 2 squadrons of RAF Eurofighter Typhoons, a squadron of A-10 Thunderbolts, and 2 squadrons of F-15Es had been assigned to provide them with close air support for the duration of the operation. If all went according to plan, in 2 days they'd link up with the main body of the 3rd Corps as they punched their way through the Chinese positions. Staff Sergeant Riker looked toward their chariots in time to watch a string of the Army's newest air-mobile weapon, the V-280 Valor tilt-rotor helicopter, start their engines. The crew chiefs stood outside the tilt-rotors as the pilots got them powered up. Steadily, the blades picked up speed until the crew chiefs gave the pilots and the troops waiting to load them a thumbs up. Riker stood up, threw his ruck on his back, and attached his rifle to his single-point sling. The CO approached him. "It's time to load up," he ordered. Then he made his way down to the next platoon's position. Riker turned to look back at his men. "All right, everyone, mount up," he yelled to be heard over the noise of the flight line. "The mission's a go, and our aircraft are ready." Riker walked over to the soldier sitting on the ground right behind him and extended a hand, helping him to his feet. Everyone assisted each other to get their gear loaded up, saying words of encouragement as they completed their tasks. The soldiers were pumped for this mission, a real mission behind enemy lines. No more fighting off militiamen on the East Coast or in Canada. This was the real deal against a massive Chinese army. Everyone lined up in single-file lines, and they walked the parking ramps to where their chariots awaited them. As they approached the V-280s, the rotor wash whipped the warm morning air into their faces. The crew chief, who was still wearing his aviator helmet, walked toward them. "Get on," he directed. Fireteam Alpha climbed into the seats facing rearward, while Fireteam Bravo loaded on the opposite side. Staff Sergeant Riker made sure to position himself next to the door facing forward. This would allow him to be among the first off the Valor. He knew he'd need to get a read on the situation on the ground ASAP. A few moments after they'd boarded the Army's newest tiltrotor, it taxied toward the runway, along with 110 Valors, Blackhawks, and Chinooks that would ferry the brigade to its objective. These helicopters are going to be busy today, thought Riker. They had 4 full brigades of the division to drop behind enemy lines. The pitch of the engines changed, and Riker felt the Valor lift off. Then they were in the air, joining up with the other helicopters in this once-in-a-lifetime massive air armada. The platoons in the V-280s would zip ahead of the Chinooks and Blackhawks to secure various landing zones for the follow-on helicopters. The Valors were swift. In their airplane mode, they could reach speeds of 322 miles per hour. They were also very nimble and could maneuver on a dime, which made them perfect for slicing through contested airspace. 20 minutes into their high-speed race south, the Valor that Riker was riding in swooped into one of the valleys, hugging the terrain as much as possible to avoid enemy aircraft and radar stations. Their main fear was surface-to-air missiles. The PLA had been building the area up with SAMs as they'd moved their front lines forward, obviously aware that this was their one weapon system that continued to give the American Air Force fits. Every now and then, Staff Sergeant Riker would spot a missile, or sometimes 2 or 3, streaking down from the sky to slam into some unknown object on the ground. Occasionally, he'd see a missile fly up to the sky above in search of a target. It was an incredibly nerve-wracking experience for Riker, knowing he could be blown from the sky and he'd never see it coming. As the air swirled around inside the bay of the tiltrotor, Sergeant Riker looked back at the painted faces of his squad. He saw both excitement and fear. They were flying into the jaws of the enemy. They'd either succeed and live to fight another battle, or they'd get smoked and be forgotten among the other casualties of the day. Near the end of their flight, the Valor exited the valley and suddenly appeared just north of their objective. The tiltrotor changed positions, shifting from flying like an airplane back to its helicopter mode, steadily bleeding off speed in preparation for landing. Looking out the side doors, Riker saw the unwelcome sight of tracer fire. Long strings of it reached out into the early morning sky in an effort to swat them down to the ground. The Valor's pilot immediately took evasive maneuvers as he sought a safe path through the treacherous sky. They soon angled to land. Several large trees swept past them until they settled down on the 9th hole of the golf course. Once on the ground, the soldiers undid their 6-point harnesses and were on the ground in no time flat. With its human cargo delivered, the tiltrotor increased speed and was once again airborne, turning for home. It was time to grab the next load of soldiers. Bang! 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 The sudden sound of a large-caliber machine gun shook them, eradicating any sense of safety Riker had in thinking maybe the enemy wasn't nearby. The soldiers scanned their sectors to find where the shooting was coming from. "Over there!" shouted Staff Sergeant Riker. He spotted several GDF 002 anti-aircraft gun positions at the far end of the golf course, rapidly firing their twin 35mm cannons at the remaining helicopters in the area. One of the Valors took a string of rounds to its engines and crew compartment and exploded seconds later. It fell to the ground, a burning hunk of useless metal and parts. "We've got more AA guns over there, Staff Sergeant," yelled one of Riker's soldiers. Turning to see what his soldiers had found, Riker saw 2 PGZ-95 self-propelled AA gun trucks moving towards their landing zone and 4 SX-2190 transport trucks packed with soldiers. "Oh, this is going to be trouble," he realized. Their lieutenant shouted to be heard over the chaos. Staff Sergeant Riker, take your squad and put those AA guns out of commission." Then the LT dashed off to get the rest of the platoon focused on taking out the PGZs and the incoming troop trucks. Riker turned to his guys. "Second squad, on me," he bellowed. He jumped up and sprinted toward the AA guns at the end of the golf course, his men not far behind. When they got closer to the enemy positions, Riker spotted what appeared to be 3 of the AA guns anchored on what was probably the highest point on the golf course. The position was protected by a couple of machine guns. Once Riker's squad had gotten within 100 yards of the position, Riker halted their advance. He looked at his second fire team leader. "Sergeant Black, your team is going to charge the enemy positions with me," he ordered. "We need to clear that position out before the next wave of helicopters show up." Riker paused for a second as he looked down at his watch. "We have roughly 10 minutes until the next wave arrives, so that doesn't leave us much time." Riker turned to his next fire team leader. "Sergeant Lighthorse, I want your fire team to hit those 2 machine gun positions with your AT-4s once I give you the signal. I want to see how close Bravo team and I can get to them before they spot us. Once you've taken those positions out with the rockets, I want your M240 gunner to lay down suppressive fire on the remaining machine gun position. You need to keep their heads down while we charge forward." The 2 fire team leaders quickly told their guys what they were going to do. The first group of guys got their 2 AT-4s ready to fire while the M240G gunner got his bipod set up and his assistant gunner unslung several additional belts of ammo. In a low crouch, Staff Sergeant Riker led the way with Bravo team toward the enemy positions. Using their night vision goggles, Riker and his team advanced stealthily through the golf course, entirely unnoticed. With the NVGs, night appeared like day as they crept up on the enemy, who probably had no idea they were about to be attacked. When they had reached the halfway point to the anti-aircraft positions, the AA guns opened fire on some unseen aircraft overhead. The loud banging of their heavy-caliber guns was unmistakable, and the bright flashes from their muzzles temporarily made it harder for Riker and his men to see. Riker continued to move forward undeterred. Then he heard the loud scream of jet engines flying overhead. The AA guns did their best to fire on the jets, but so far they were unsuccessful. Seeing that they were practically on top of the enemy positions, Riker motioned for his guys to find a covered position and get ready. Once he saw them take a knee behind something, he depressed the talk button on his communications system. "Now, Sergeant Black," Riker said in a voice barely above a whisper. Pop. Swoosh. Boom! The AT-4 rockets flew fast and true, slamming into the 2 machine gun positions overlooking the golf course. Then the M240G gunner opened fire on the enemy positions. His bright red tracers looked like lasers as they reached out and hit the Chinese positions. "Follow me!" Riker shouted over the roar of the machine guns. Riker and the 6 soldiers with him were less than 20 meters from the enemy positions when they charged the remaining distance. As they got closer, their heavy machine gunner to their rear stopped firing so he wouldn't inadvertently hit them. When Sergeant Riker reached the nearest enemy position, he saw it was empty. There wasn't anyone in it. He didn't stop, continuing to charge into the center of the enemy position. Riker found around 10 guys manning the GDF 002 AA guns. By the time the Chinese soldiers realized Riker and several other soldiers were inside their position, it was too late. Riker fired off several 3-round bursts from his M4 into the enemy soldiers. The other soldiers that had charged with Sergeant Riker unloaded on the remaining Chinese soldiers. The rest of Riker's fire team then cleared out the enemy position and then went to work on turning the position into a fortified stronghold for the Americans to use. One of the first things Riker noticed about the enemy soldiers they'd just killed was that they didn't appear to be frontline PLA soldiers. They were older and less physically fit than the Chinese soldiers they'd encountered in the past. Riker figured they might have been militia soldiers or reservists. Looking at the AA guns, Riker saw a couple of his soldiers were already trying to figure out how to use them. One of their guys radioed the lieutenant. "Sir, we've secured the position. If we can figure out how to use these guns, do you want us to try to use them to support you?" he asked. As Riker's gaze went further down the road that led to the golf course, he saw that the 2 PGZ-95 anti-aircraft trucks had been reduced to burning wrecks. But the other 4 SX-2190 troop transport trucks had stopped and dismounted their infantry. It looked like at least 50 or 60 enemy soldiers were now on foot, exchanging shots with his platoon. "See if you can lower the AA gun and aim it at those enemy soldiers," Riker directed. "Let's see if we can't take some of them out." A couple of his soldiers finally figured out how to traverse and lower the gun. Once they'd managed to reposition the first one, they promptly got the other 2 ready. Seconds later, their first captured AA gun sent a slew of rounds at the PLA soldiers, cutting many of them down. They kept firing short bursts at the cluster of enemy soldiers wherever they found them, as the company continued to secure the rest of the golf course for the incoming wave. The next set of helicopters to land was the CH-47 Chinooks. They offloaded more soldiers, along with additional crates of ammo and 5-gallon jerry cans of water. Staff Sergeant Riker and his men continued to hold the AA gun position, and the rest of their platoon eventually made it over to join them. Their position was at the front of the golf course closest to town, so it would be one of the first positions assaulted by the Chinese once they sent a substantial force to the golf course. Knowing this, Riker and the rest of the platoon did their best to prepare the position to repel the inevitable enemy attack. An hour went by. The dawn slowly began to fight back the darkness. Meanwhile, down in the city of Walsenburg, the fighting was intense. There was a near-constant crescendo of gunfire and explosions. Illumination flares were constantly being fired over the city in the direction of the golf course. The third set of helicopters to arrive was a string of CH-47s that had sling-loaded a dozen M119 howitzers and brought in their crews. The 105mm cannons would help provide the ground pounders some fire support as they made their move to capture the city and the interstate that ran parallel to it. Following the Chinooks was another wave of Blackhawks, which offloaded more soldiers. While these new units were getting themselves sorted out, the artillerymen got their guns positioned the way they wanted, so they'd be ready to action calls for fire support. Colorado Springs, Colorado. Peterson Air Force Base. Major John Zamboni, who went by the call sign Zombie, held his hand against the wall above the urinal while he emptied his bladder. When he finished his business, he zipped up and walked over to the sink. As he washed his hands, Zombie looked at himself in the mirror. What he saw looking back at him was an exhausted, hollowed-out shell of a man who hadn't had more than 6 consecutive hours of sleep in 3 weeks. He hadn't seen his family in 2 months, and he wondered if they were even still alive. Zombie's family had unfortunately been caught behind enemy lines when the PLA had broken through the Marine positions in Yuma, Arizona, and the Army's position around Fort Huachuca, Arizona. When that had happened, the PLA had been able to cut off Tucson before anyone had a chance to get out. His squadron had barely made it out of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base when Chinese tanks were spotted heading down the interstate. Since that fateful day, many people in the 354th Fighter Squadron hadn't heard from their families at all. All they knew was what they were being told by the media and the occasional tidbits of information they'd gleaned from the command. News of what was happening in the occupied zones was hard to come by and not particularly reliable. When Zombie walked back into the squadron room, their flight surgeon walked up to him. "Take 2 of these," he ordered. "They'll help you get through the next couple of hours. When you guys get back from this next mission, we're going to put the squadron on 12 hours of mandatory crew rest. You guys are getting too burned out, and we need you sharp and ready to fight in the coming days." Nodding, Zombie swallowed the 2 uppers and chased them with a glass of water. He took a seat in the squadron room and waited for the briefer to come in and give them their next assignment. He looked around him. The other pilots seemed just as tired as he felt. A few minutes later, a captain walked in and went right to the front of the room. She cleared her throat. "The main offensive officially starts today," she announced. "As you know, the last couple of days have largely been spent preparing the front lines for the armored assault today. Your main objective is to support our armored forces as they look to break through the enemy lines. This will be a tank-busting mission," the captain continued. "You'll be loaded up with Mavericks. Once the squadron is airborne, you'll head to Sector F and look for targets of opportunity. Your operational zone is going to be Sectors E, F, and G. Do not stray outside your operational sectors. There are a lot of other aircraft operating in the AO, and we don't want any of you guys to accidentally get hit by any friendly aircraft." One of the pilots raised his hand, and the captain nodded for him to speak. "Is there any possibility of enemy aircraft showing up?" he asked. "I don't think so," the briefer responded. "But if they do, your aircraft still have 2 Sidewinder missiles, and there's a flight of F-22 Raptors loitering above you for assistance." A few of the other pilots had questions, but once those were answered, the briefing dismissed, and everyone headed out to their aircraft. Zombie began his pre-flight checklist and walked around the aircraft. He looked over each of the missiles, making sure everything looked correct. When he was satisfied with what he saw, he moved around to the front of the aircraft and climbed up the ladder to get in. As he was sitting down, the quiet night sky suddenly filled with the noise of aircraft engines and helicopters. This was gearing up to be a massive air operation. Squadrons from all over the country had been arriving throughout the past week in preparation for this major push. If they were successful, the ground pounders might be able to break through the PLA lines and hopefully drive them back into New Mexico. With his body strapped to his ejection seat and his helmet hooked up to his communications and oxygen system, Zombie lowered his canopy and ran through the rest of his checklist. One of the airmen disconnected the aerospace ground equipment that had provided his aircraft with external power until he got his engines going. "Bulldogs, bulldog action," called his squadron CO over the radio. "Let's get airborne and go blow up some tanks." Zombie gave the engines a bit of throttle, and his A-10 fell in position with the rest of the squadron. They'd take off in pairs and then rush toward their objectives, hunting for targets. Zombie lined his aircraft up on the right side of the runway. His turn finally arrived, and he applied more power to his engines. By the time he'd reached about 2/3 of the way down the runway, his plane had enough speed built up for him to lift off the ground. Steadily, he pulled back on the flight controls, and the plane clawed its way into the sky. "Hey, Zombie, you ready to go kill us some chinks?" his wingman Joker asked with a laugh. "You know I don't like that name," Zombie said angrily. "But yes, I'm ready to go blow up some enemy tanks." Zombie and his wife had adopted 2 kids from Asia, so he didn't particularly care for his wingman's choice of words. But Joker being Joker, he liked to use whatever pejorative was relevant to the enemy they were attacking. In the Middle East, it was ragheads. In Afghanistan, it was dirt farmers. In this war, it was either Krauts, Canucks, Frogs, Ivans, or Chinks. Joker sighed over the radio, clearly a bit irritated by his partner's sense of morality. "All right, Zombie, I'll follow your lead." The 2 flew in silence for another 10 minutes as they approached the front lines. As they got closer, below them there were lines and lines of American main battle tanks and other armored vehicles, all lining up for the main attack against the Chinese positions. In the lead of these massive armored columns were 2 distinctive vehicles. One was a tank with a specially designed thrasher system attached to the front. This piece of equipment would spin in a circle, whipping close to a dozen metal chains in front of it as it drove forward. It would essentially clear a path for the tanks behind it through any PLA minefields they had sown. The second vehicle was another specialized mine-clearing vehicle. This truck would fire out a string of explosives several hundred meters in front of it, and then the controller would detonate those explosives, creating a massive hole through any existing minefield. The two vehicles would work in tandem, clearing a path for the armored force behind them. As Zombie and Joker got closer to the front lines, they saw strings of enemy tracer fire rising from the ground, almost like a laser show in the sky. The enemy gunners were searching for the F-15Es and Vipers that were hunting them. These were the aircraft performing the critically important Wild Weasel missions for the A-10s. They'd largely cleared the battle space of enemy SAMs and aircraft, allowing the much slower Warthogs the opportunity to swoop in and wipe out the enemy's tanks and armored vehicles for the ground element. Looking briefly at his clock, Zombie saw it was now 02:15 hours. Right on time. "All Bulldogs, good hunting and good luck," called out their squadron CO. "See you guys in Valhalla or the squadron room." Zombie looked down at his ground targeting radar, searching for targets of opportunity. He depressed his talk button to speak to Joker. "If you find a target before I do, call it out," he said. "Let's figure out what we have down here before we engage. I want to take out as many of these bastards as possible in one pass. How copy?" Joker just clicked his radio talk button twice, acknowledging the order. Zombie knew he was hard at work, trying to find the enemy armor as well. While flying at night had its advantages, it also made it hard to find some targets. Granted, a tank would usually illuminate pretty easily on their IR scope. However, it was nearly impossible to tell if the column of enemy vehicles was being protected by AA guns, since those systems were typically fixed to a spot and didn't have a running engine to give away their location via heat signature. Watching the battlefield before them was almost surreal. Never in his 14 years in the Air Force had Zombie seen so much anti-aircraft ground fire or friendly aircraft attacking an enemy position. "Makes you kind of glad we're still loitering on the edge of the battle space, as opposed to flying in that soup," Joker said over their radio net. "Yeah, you're not kidding. I say we let the Vipers and Eagles clean up some of that ground fire for us before we go into that mess." "All Bulldogs be advised, we have inbound J7s and J11s, announced their CO. "We're going to move to Sector A while the Raptors clear them out for us. Continue to stay frosty and keep an eye out for enemy targets." "Oh, damn," Joker said. "I'm glad they warned us about those J11s. Those are nasty fighters." Zombie snorted. "Joker, any fighter coming at us is a nasty fighter," he quipped with a chuckle. "A-10s aren't exactly fast planes." As they flew a bit further from the front lines, Zombie observed some of the Vipers and Eagle drivers continue to pound the AA guns and SAMs. Steadily, some of the enemy fire did begin to dissipate. Either the Wild Weasels were silencing them, or the gunners had gotten wise and turned their radars off, waiting for them to leave. Switching his radio over to the frequency the Raptors were operating on, Zombie listened in on the aerial fight taking place above them. From his perspective, it sounded like a one-sided turkey shoot. The Raptors were absolute beasts in the air, and this current war was proving exactly how deadly they could be. Heck, they had a better combat record than the F-35, and that was saying something. 5 minutes went by before Zombie switched back to his own squadron's NAT. Joker finally got through to him. "What happened to you? You weren't responding to my calls." "Sorry about that. I jumped on the Raptors frequency." "Well, while you were checked out of what's going on here, Bulldog told us a flight of B-1s is going to hit the enemy lines. Once they're done, we're supposed to swoop in and pick off any stragglers that survive the whoop-ass that's about to be unleashed on them," Joker explained, a bit of sarcasm in his voice. Zombie chided himself for not staying on his own squadron's frequency. He knew he'd probably get scolded about it later. He sighed and then depressed his talk button. "Sorry about that, Joker. Thanks for covering for me. I owe you another beer." "No worries, Zombie. But seriously, get your head back in the game. We're about to fly into a hornet's nest. I'm the wingman here, not you, so man up." Zombie nodded, even though no one else could see him. He knew Joker was right. His mind wasn't in the fight like it needed to be. He needed to push his family concerns out of his mind. They're either alive or they're dead. Either way, I can't do anything about it, he realized. He needed to do his part in creating a hole for the American tanks to bust through. "Thanks, Joker. Let's move to 6,000 feet and see if we can get a better picture of what we're about to fly into." As their aircraft descended below 10,000 feet, the flight of 4 B-1 bombers flew in across the Chinese front lines. The 4 planes released 336 500-pound unguided bombs across a 3-mile stretch of the front lines. It was almost like watching a string of M80 fireworks going off during the 4th of July, only these weren't firecrackers. They were 500-pound behemoths meant to kill hundreds, if not thousands, of enemy soldiers. "Okay, Bulldogs, that's our cue," announced their CO. "Let's go." Together, the Warthogs moved from their holding pattern into an attack pattern. All around the battle space, the Air Force had layers of different squadrons loitering, waiting to be sent in. The air battle managers would either send in a squadron to suppress enemy SAMs or AA guns, or they'd send in a ground attack squadron. This process of sending in different types of squadrons would largely continue unabated throughout the day as they attempted to break through the enemy lines. "Okay, Joker, follow me in," directed Zombie. "I found a string of tanks moving towards the front line. They're in Sector G heading toward us. Do you see them yet?" A second later, Joker clicked twice on his radio, letting him know he spotted them. The two of them increased their speed a bit as they leveled out at 3,000 feet and began their attack run. Zombie placed a targeting reticle on 3 of the targets his computer had determined were tanks. That information was instantaneously shared with his wingman to ensure Joker didn't target the same 3 tanks. When they got within 8 kilometers of the tanks, Zombie and Joker fired off their first barrage of air-to-surface missiles. Once the missiles left their wing pylons, Zombie scanned for the next batch of armored vehicles. All around them, Maverick missiles flew into the dark night sky and raced towards their intended targets. As Zombie and Joker flew closer to the actual front lines, the warning lights popped on, letting them know that enemy ground radars nearby had been turned on. 2 o'clock. Looks like at least 8 enemy tanks, Joker called out. Zombie turned his aircraft in the direction of the enemy tanks and began to paint them with his targeting radar. He had 3 missiles left, and he planned on scoring 3 more tank kills. Then they'd gain some more altitude and swoop in to carry out a gun run on the remaining enemy armor. "Firing," Zombie announced. His 3 missiles flew out from under his wings and were on their way to their targets. Joker's missiles had also joined the fray as well. Before Zombie could say or do anything else, his warning alarms blared. His aircraft had been painted by an enemy ground radar. His plane's countermeasure system took over, firing off some flares. Zombie gave the aircraft more power and turned hard to the right as he sought to gain some altitude and put some distance between himself and the AA guns below. While he was taking evasive maneuvers, strings of red and green tracer fire flew past his plane. Some flew over his wings, some under. Then a stream of bullets made a direct hit on one of his wings, tearing holes in it. 5 seconds later, Zombie and Joker had made it to 10,000 feet, out of range of the remaining AA guns below. Zombie still radioed the air battle manager in the J-Stars plane further back to let him know what had happened. Some F-16s were dispatched to go deal with the anti-aircraft guns. Now that they were clear of the imminent threat, Zombie checked on his wingman. "You all right, Joker?" "Yeah. I don't think they hit me. Or if they did, I'm not showing anything serious. How about you, Zombie?" I took a couple of hits on my right wing, but it's still operable. Let's get ourselves in position to finish off that armored column." "Roger that. You lead the way." The two warthogs leveled out at 11,000 feet. Zombie and Joker positioned themselves to strafe the enemy column from the rear. They'd now flown some 20 kilometers behind the front lines and found themselves in a target-rich environment. The PLA was moving a lot of their armored vehicles to the front to meet the American armor head-on. "This armored battle's been brewing for months," thought Zombie. Zombie would swoop in first around 3,000 feet and strafe the armored vehicles with his infamous 30mm chain gun. Joker would follow right behind him to finish off whatever he'd missed. They'd then both climb back up out of range of the enemy AA guns before looking for another column to attack. They'd continue the process until they eventually ran out of ammo and had to fly back home. "Ah, damn, that's a lot of AA fire," Joker grumbled. Zombie looked to the right and saw one of the other flights of A-10s swooping in to strafe the enemy. He knew in a few seconds that would be him and Joker. He wasn't relishing what he was about to have to fly through. It was terrifying, all those bullets being fired at his plane, and he knew if he got hit in the wrong spot, his plane would go down and he'd end up trapped behind enemy lines. "Let's get this over with, Joker," Zombie muttered. "Follow me in." He increased his throttle and dipped the nose of his plane into a dive. When this whole crazy war had started, Zombie had had one of his ground crew members attach a shrieking siren on the undercarriage of his plane. He knew it was against regulations, but he didn't care. They had found a way to rig it so that it would only work when he dove at a specific angle. But whenever he hit it just right, his A-10 sounded like a German Stuka dive bomber. As the siren screamed, Zombie could see the terrified defenders below him scurry every which way, trying to get away from him. It was an exhilarating feeling. He lined up his gun sights on the rear of the column and depressed the trigger. His 30mm chain gun made its sinister tearing sound as hundreds of depleted uranium rounds tore through the enemy column. Zombie's first set of rounds hammered several infantry fighting vehicles, blowing 3 of them up easily. His next string of rounds ripped through 3 ZTZ-96 tanks. As soon as Zombie saw the 3 tanks explode, he pulled up hard on his flight control and applied more power to his engines. A lot of guns were flashing in his direction, and Zombie knew a lot of hot lead was doing its best to shoot his plane down. While his Warthog climbed back into the sky, strings of red and green tracers flew up after him. The enemy ground fire crisscrossed the sky in front of him. Zombie knew his best way out of this was to climb out of the area as fast as he could. He fired off some flares to draw off some of the radar-controlled AA guns and keep any man-pads from zeroing in on him. A couple of explosions disrupted the air behind his A-10, causing some turbulence. The flares had worked. His warning lights were flashing in an assaulting way, and his alarms blared in his ears. The missile warning systems had been activated, radar warning lights were on, and critical equipment on his plane had been hit. But Zombie couldn't react to any of these alarms until his Warthog was out of range of the ground fire. While he continued his climb, Zombie decided to check on his wingman. "How are you holding out, Joker?" Joker let out a few F-bombs. "I took a few hits on my way in," he finally responded. "I got a handful of vehicles, but my left engine is shot to hell, and so is my right wing." Zombie could hear the tension and fear in his partner's voice, and he worried about his wingman. Joker was a junior captain, and he'd only been with the squadron for 2 years. While he'd served a tour in Afghanistan in 2019, he hadn't really seen much action during that deployment, so this war was proving to be his first real test. Thus far, he'd been a stellar pilot. He'd held strong when many other pilots had cracked, unable to handle the stress. Zombie knew if the hotshot pilot lived long enough, he'd make a good squadron commander. "How are you holding out, boss?" asked Joker. Now that he wasn't actively evading AA fire anymore, Zombie looked more closely at his gauges, and then did his best to turn around and look at his wings and tail section. One of his alarms was alerting him that he was losing hydraulic pressure in his main system. Zombie used the manual switch and moved the aircraft over to the alternate system. Unless the backup system was shot up as well, he should be fine. Next, he looked at his engine warning sign. The plane was riding a little rough, and it sounded like he had something grinding in the left engine. Zombie dialed down the throttle on the left engine, and that reduced the noise and the shaking. The engine appeared to stabilize, although he wasn't going to get a lot of thrust from it. Zombie depressed his talk button, finally responding to Joker. "My primary hydraulic system is down. I'm on the backup system for right now. My left engine also took some hits, so I've had to throttle it back. Both my wings are shot, but somehow I'm still airborne. Let's fly up to 11,000 feet and get back across to our side of the line in case either of us has to bail." "Bulldog actual to all Bulldog elements. Sound off," ordered their CO over the squadron net. It was time to get a count of how many of them had made it. One by one, the pilots reported in. Zombie and Joker were Bulldogs 9 and 10. When they called in, only one pilot appeared to have been shot down. They then got to Bulldogs 15 and 16. They were radio silent. No one saw them, so it was assumed they had been shot down. It'd be up to the AWACS and J-Stars to figure out where they had gone down. They'd determine if a search and rescue mission could be launched to try and retrieve them. Zombie and Joker were just about to cross the main part of the front lines when a J-7 swooped in out of nowhere, guns ablaze. All Zombie saw was a string of bright objects slamming into his canopy, shattering it. The exposed part of his face was suddenly buffeted with cold air, which startled him half to death. Zombie wasn't sure if it was just a reaction to his past training or if his mind was on autopilot, but he had somehow switched his targeting computer from air-to-ground mode to air-to-air mode, which activated his 2 Sidewinder missiles. He banked his aircraft to the left as he sought to get a bead on the bastard that had just shot them up. Seconds later, he heard the warbly tone in his headset that told him a Sidewinder had a solid lock. He depressed his firing button, and the missile leapt from its rail and flew after the Chinese interceptor. The missile streaked after the attacker, detonating just behind the rear of the plane. The back half of the J-7 exploded in flames. The pilot ejected out of the stricken aircraft just before the plane spiraled a trail of smoke on its descent to the ground. Zombie pulled up on his flight control. The wind assaulted his body hard. His body was shaking from the shock of everything. Suddenly, he realized that his left leg was wet. It was only then that he noticed he had a piece of metal sticking out of his left thigh. Blood was oozing out around the wound, but it didn't increase with his pulses. "Oh, thank God," he thought. It didn't look like he'd nicked an artery or anything serious. "Who got that enemy plane?" asked their CO. "That was Zombie. He smoked that guy," Joker called out for him. "Nice shooting, Zombie. Are you okay?" It took Zombie a moment to reply. His mind was still racing, and he was trying to get the plane leveled out and apply a pressure bandage to his leg. "Negative, sir," he finally said. "My canopy got shot up. Some sort of metal object hit me in the leg, too. It's sticking out of my left thigh. I'm attempting to put a pressure bandage on it to help slow the bleeding, but I'm going to need to land ASAP." "Copy that, Bulldog 9, his CO answered. "You land first. I'll radio ahead that we need EMS to meet you on the ground. Hang in there, Zombie. You can make it." The next 30 minutes were the toughest 30 minutes of Zombie's life. His plane could only fly so fast with one good engine, and he was fighting to keep the plane from shaking itself to pieces from all the holes in his wings and fuselage. Then he started feeling lightheaded. Zombie had to keep shaking his head as he fought off the desire to just close his eyes. Several times he thought he'd just eject and let a SAR team come get him, but he knew the fastest way to get help was to fight through the blackness that was beckoning him and land at the airbase. The sun had finally pushed the darkness away. It was a beautiful day, not a cloud in the sky, just lots of contrails from the hundreds of aircraft flying back and forth between Peterson Air Base and the front lines. Zombie finally spotted the city of Colorado Springs and started guiding his plane to the runway on Peterson. The control tower hailed him, saying they'd cleared the runway for him to land and that EMS was standing by. As he approached the runway, Zombie saw a string of fire trucks and ambulances with their lights on, ready to render him aid once he landed. He saw rows of F-15s and F-16s waiting on the taxiway. They were loaded down with more bombs and missiles to go pummel the Chinese. Zombie reached over to lower his landing gear. He held his breath for a second as he pulled the lever to lower the wheels. He let out a sigh of relief when he saw the green light come on, indicating they'd locked in place. Zombie reduced his throttle. The altimeter continued to drop. The runway appeared much larger as he continued to lose altitude and speed. Then Zombie saw he was about to slam into it, so he pulled up on the stick a bit. His engines were almost ready to stall when his rear wheels finally touched down. He leveled the nose, allowing the front wheels to grab the runway. Once he had the aircraft firmly on land, he tried to use his air brakes but quickly discovered they'd been shot to hell and weren't worth a damn. He swiftly applied the wheel brakes as he throttled the engines back to an idle position. He was fortunate that he had landed at such a slow speed, or he might have run out of runway. It was a real challenge to slow the plane enough without his air brakes or the ability to reverse the engines. His plane was so shot up, it was a veritable miracle that he'd even made it back to the base. As the plane finally came to a halt, Zombie guided it off the main runway to the side of the taxiway. He then shut down the engines and finally pulled off his face mask. He took in a couple of deep breaths and then disconnected his helmet from the aircraft. He started to unstrap himself, but then the first rescue vehicles began to arrive. A ladder was thrown up against the side of his plane, and a paramedic climbed up to him. "Where are you hurt, sir?" the man asked. Barely able to keep his head up straight, Zombie pointed to his left leg, which was now soaked in blood. The medic checked to see if his leg was pinned to the chair or if they could move him. Once he determined that Zombie wasn't attached to the plane, he tied a tourniquet around Zombie's leg to stem any possible gushes of blood once they started to move him. As the medic tightened the fabric, Zombie winced with pain and fought to suppress a scream. It hurt like hell, but he knew they needed to do it. A few minutes went by. A stair truck pulled up to the A-10, and a second rescue worker was able to climb up there with the paramedic. Then the two of them did their best to gingerly pull him out of the cockpit. By this point, there was a pretty big crowd of people coming over to look at Zombie's plane and to check on him, and most of his squadron had already landed. As he was being carried down the stair truck, Zombie turned his head to look at his plane. He was shocked to see how much damage it had sustained. He could see holes through numerous parts of the fuselage, the wings, and the tail end of the plane. A moment later, he was sitting in an ambulance, which sped off to the base hospital. For the time being, Zombie knew his part in the war was over. His only goal now was to recover and see if he could get another plane and rejoin the fight. The following day, Major John Zamboni, Zombie, was flown to Walter Reed, along with several hundred other wounded soldiers and airmen. A month later, he'd be awarded the Purple Heart and the Air Force Cross, the second highest medal in the Air Force. Crowley, Colorado. The Mississippi Army National Guard's 155th Armor Brigade Combat Team had been assigned as the lead element to bust through the enemy lines south of Crowley. The attack would allow them to press the enemy's right flank. Their ultimate objective was to link up with the 101st Airborne Unit at Walsenburg, some 120 kilometers to the southwest of their position. It was a lot of ground to cover in a couple of days. They'd be facing down the PLA 4th Armored Brigade, the 46th Motorized Infantry Division, and the 68th Mechanized Infantry Brigade. It was a sizable enemy force standing between them and their objective. Fortunately, they weren't the only ones assigned this task. They had the 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team from the 1st Infantry Division saddled up with them to help punch a hole in the lines. Once they broke through, the rest of the 1st ID would follow through as they looked to make a mad dash on Walsenburg. Hopefully, they'd encircle several enemy divisions and force them to surrender. If everything worked according to plan, they could potentially collapse the enemy lines. At least, that was the stated goal the division commander had told everyone during last night's commander's brief. As the Battalion S3, Captain Reagan, who had just been promoted to major, was stuck having to attend such meetings. Truth be told, he'd rather be in a tank, but until a more senior major came along or a slot opened up in one of the brigade's battalions, he was stuck being the operations officer for the battalion. It frustrated him since he developed a real skill at being a tank commander. Luckily, he was dual-hatted as the battalion XO should the commander get taken out. In the meantime, he'd ride along into battle in the back of their new armored multi-purpose vehicle. Looking at his watch, Major Reagan saw it was now 04:45 hours. In another 15 minutes, they'd initiate their attack. In another 5 minutes, the battalion's vehicles would all turn on at the same time. They synchronized the engine starts, so if enemy scouts were in the area, they'd have a hard time identifying how many vehicle engines had just fired up. Reagan heard the sounds of jets above them and instinctively looked up. It was pitch black. The only light came from the millions of stars. Every now and then, he'd hear an explosion somewhere above them. Sometimes he might even catch something blowing up in the sky. All Reagan knew was that the Air Force was launching one of the largest air attacks since the beginning of the war. They had moved nearly all of their combat aircraft from the East Coast and Midwest to the Southwest for this operation. While Reagan was looking off into the night sky, wondering how the air campaign was going, one of the sergeants came up to him. "It's nearly time to roll out, sir," he announced. Reagan was about to climb back into the track when one of the young soldiers asked him, "Do you think we'll break through?" Reagan paused for a moment, then looked at the young man. "I do," he responded. "Of all the battles I've fought in, I'm most confident about this one. You hear all those explosions going off in the distance?" The soldier nodded. "That's the Air Force bombing the crap out of them. Next is going to come the rolling artillery barrage. Those Chinese soldiers are about to feel the full combined weight of the American Air Force and the U.S. Army's armored fist. We're going to punch through their lines, and we're going to push them all the way back to Mexico." The soldier smiled. He finished his cigarette off and climbed in the track with Reagan. The young man's job was to work the radios and make sure they didn't have any malfunctions during the heat of battle. Reagan took his seat and looked at the Blue Force tracker. He saw all the units of the battalion. Their drone operator had just launched several of their scout drones to fly out ahead of them. As the drones identified enemy vehicles, they'd relay that information to their integrated friendly and foe tracking system on their digital map. Reagan would have a bird's-eye view of the entire battle as it unfolded, allowing him to better relay the information to the battalion commander and better direct their artillery fire and units. Reagan turned to find his fist LNO. "Captain Gillum, make sure your gun bunnies are ready," he directed. "We're moving out in a few minutes. The drones should start to identify some targets for us shortly. I'd like to get some steel on steel before our tanks get in range, if possible." Captain Gillum was their artillery LNO from the 2nd Battalion, 114th Field Artillery Regiment. They were a self-propelled 155mm Paladin unit and their sole artillery support for this offensive. "Copy that, sir," Gillum replied. "I've already relayed that we'll be sending a number of fire missions through in the near future." Reagan nodded. He felt about as ready as possible for the coming battle. He had a lot on his plate as the S3 and XO, And while he'd still rather be in a tank fighting, he also knew this type of experience he was gaining was going to make him an exceptional battalion commander when the time was right. Their vehicle lurched forward, and they were officially on the move. 5 minutes into their drive, the drones that had flown ahead of them began to relay targets. Reagan's digital battle map was getting populated with enemy tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, air defense vehicles, and a ton of foot mobiles. Major Reagan knew that infantrymen were the death knell to tanks. They could pop up out of a fighting position and fire a simple rocket that could blow out a tank or disable a tank. They had to be dealt with swiftly. Reagan turned to his fifth LNO and ordered in some artillery strikes. He specifically wanted airburst rounds that would shower the enemy infantrymen with more shrapnel than standard ground bursts. For the next 10 minutes, the battalion steadily moved in closer as their artillery battalion pounded the enemy positions. Then the tanks were in range to exchange fire, adding their own carnage to the landscape. One of their scout drones had moved further behind the enemy lines, giving them a glimpse of what lay ahead. Roughly 10 kilometers behind the front, columns of enemy tanks and infantry fighting vehicles were forming up. It looked like the PLA was waiting to see where the Americans were going to throw the bulk of their force and then hit them with a counterattack. Major Reagan reached for the radio that would connect him to their Air Force LNO at Brigade and relayed what their drone was seeing. He asked if they could get an airstrike on those units. The airman on the other end said that they had a number of aircraft on standby for a mission just like this. The battle along the front lines continued, with the American and Chinese tanks exchanging fire from their maximum range. Then, 4 American aircraft swooped into the enemy's rear area, where they found the waiting units. They hit the PLA tanks with dozens of 500-pound bombs, destroying many of the infantry fighting vehicles. While the battle raged, Reagan watched a fair bit of it happening from the couple of scout UAVs they had launched at the outset of the battle. They'd already swapped out one of the UAVs when its battery had been running low. Another one of their UAVs had been shot down about 30 minutes into the fight. Watching the battle unfold like this from the sky above was amazing and gave Reagan a perspective on battle he hadn't had before. The UAV was able to help him better track where each of the battalion's and brigade's vehicles was in relation to the enemy, which was proving helpful. Reagan was easily able to relay what he was seeing to the battalion and company commanders so they could respond better. Reagan remembered something he'd read in college about how the Germans were the first to incorporate radios into their tanks at the outset of World War II. It was such a revolutionary concept at the time, and it allowed the Germans to coordinate their air and ground attacks so effectively that a much smaller German unit could outmaneuver and defeat a much larger British or French force. Major Reagan couldn't help but see what they were doing with the integration of UAVs into their unit tracking system as a similar advancement. He was spotting gaps in the enemy positions in real time, allowing him to relay that information directly to the units that could exploit it. When the sun had finally brushed the darkness aside, it revealed an even greater level of destruction than what the UAVs had been able to relay in the darkness. After a couple of hours of relentless combat, Reagan witnessed the true toll the battle had taken on the men fighting it and the machines they used to wage it. Major Reagan saw a mass graveside of American and Chinese armored vehicles strewn around a moon-like landscape where there had once been a beautiful tract of land. Looking at the digital map of the battlefield, Reagan watched his old company push past the original enemy lines. They were quickly followed by the rest of the battalion and eventually Reagan's own track. He missed his old unit. It pained him not to be the one leading them through this battle. He just hoped his guys were doing okay in his absence. Then, knowing his track was driving through the original Chinese lines, Reagan had an overwhelming urge to see the situation with his own eyes, not on some digital feed from a UAV. Major Reagan swapped positions with their turret gunner for a minute, and his eyes were assaulted with the sight of burning vehicles, upturned military equipment, and blown-apart bunkers intermixed with the twisted and torn bodies. The stench of diesel fuel, feces, and burning flesh was almost overwhelming. The fighting for this particular piece of land had been brutal. His headquarters track had been positioned near the rear of the battalion, so he hadn't experienced any of the fighting directly. Seeing this as they passed through was unnerving. Reagan turned to look behind them. The next battalion of tanks was moving through the hole in the enemy lines they had created. Further behind them were the mechanized infantry units. The Bradleys and Stryker vehicles ferried in a lot of their infantry support units. It was a chaotic scene of death and destruction his track was driving through. He felt an overwhelming sorrow when he realized that this was just one part of the lines. As the two massive armies came to blows, this same scene was unfolding at multiple different points, and the destruction probably stretched for miles. Chapter 18. The Camps. Metcalf, Mississippi. DHS Detention Camp 14. Martin stood before the federal judge as he awaited his sentence. For the past 2 weeks, he had watched and listened as the prosecutor had laid out the evidence against him. The NSA had provided copies of his social media posts on Facebook and Instagram as evidence of his intent to fight against the federal government. Then they'd showed multiple blog posts Martin had written about wanting to do more than just stand up against the corrupt regime of the Sachs administration. The prosecutor then played the most damning evidence, the video statement he'd created on his computer but had not sent, explaining his reasoning for joining the resistance and how he felt it his duty to fight against what he viewed as an evil dictatorship. The prosecutor played several different UAV videos for the jury that showed him lying on the roof of the building in Three Rivers, Michigan, the day he'd been detained. They played radio intercepts where he was relaying target information to the Dutch commandos and his fellow militiamen working the mortar tubes. Next, the prosecutors played the footage showing him using his hunting rifle to shoot at 2 helicopters, killing 3 of the pilots. The jury watched as the helicopters crashed, killing several more soldiers. Martin hadn't expected to see all this evidence. The weight of it hung over him like a giant stone, and a wave of guilt washed over him when he realized how many people had been killed as a result of his actions. Martin's case had lasted a lot longer than the trials of the other prisoners who'd been labeled traitors. It had taken nearly 3 full months before everything had been compiled and the proceedings had started. His defense attorney had tried to rush the case and begin the trial with the evidence authorities had when he arrived, which wasn't much. But the prosecutor had convinced the judge to let them collect and then present their facts all at once. For better or worse, Martin's trial was also being televised. The government prosecutors had requested that his case be shown to the rest of the country so it could be used as a deterrent against future militia attacks. The government was doing their best to show the country and the world how this sinister scheme to supplant the American government with a proxy government chosen by foreigners had fomented a bloody civil war. Martin's case was also being used as evidence of how foreign actors had manipulated people's grievances for political gain. When he had arrived at the camp, Martin had been viewed as a hero by the prisoners wearing the pink jumpsuits. He was seen as a man who'd stood up to the government and killed many soldiers. Then, as more evidence was shown and the foreign aspect was brought into play, that perception changed. It changed for Martin. It changed for everyone. The sudden realization of how they had all been played by foreign countries was overwhelming for many. Support for anti-government militias eroded across the country, leading many of them to throw down their arms. They did their best to fade away into obscurity. Steadily, as the war progressed with China, many of the state governments that had rebelled against the federal government came back into the fold. The governors and legislators realized that they, too, had been deceived. While many people had deep political disagreements, they still believed in the idea of a free America. When the horrors of what the Chinese military was doing in the occupied territories came to light, many people didn't want to believe something like this could happen. The thought of the sick and elderly being systematically killed off and the outright kidnapping of young women only added further resentment toward these foreign invaders. The idea that the Chinese had cloaked themselves as liberators now only further infuriated the country. As Martin sat in his chair, waiting to hear the verdict, he resigned himself to his fate. He knew he was guilty. He'd been used, but now he was the one who would have to pay. Still, it frustrated him that things had turned out like they had. It wasn't supposed to be like this. But there he was, in a pink jumpsuit with shackles on, awaiting his fate. Then the judge walked into the room. "All rise for the Honorable Jessica Lake," ordered the bailiff. Martin stood up with his public defender, as did everyone else in the room. When the judge took her seat, everyone else followed suit. Judge Lake turned to face the jurors, asking the inevitable question. "Have you reached a decision?" The lead juror stood up, replying for them. "We have, Your Honor." The juror then handed the bailiff an envelope. Everyone in the courtroom waited with bated breath for the judge to say or do something. They all watched her facial expressions when she opened the envelope, hoping they might be able to glean something from how she reacted. The judge did not betray any emotion at all. After reading the paper, the judge turned back to the lead juror. "On the first count of knowingly colluding with a foreign power to overthrow the government of the United States of America, how do you find the defendant?" The lead juror, a woman in her mid-50s, looked at Martin as she replied, "We find the defendant, Martin Brown, guilty." "On the second count of actively taking up arms to aid in the violent overthrow of the government of the United States of America, how do you find the defendant?" "We find the defendant, Martin Brown, guilty." "On the third count of committing treason against the government of the United States of America, how do you find the defendant?" "We find the defendant, Martin Brown, guilty." "On the fourth count of premeditated murder of 14 U.S. military service members, how do you find the defendant?" "We find the defendant, Martin Brown, guilty." As Martin sat there listening to one count after another being read off, the jury came back with guilty verdict after guilty verdict. "I'm toast," he realized. It was obvious he was going to get the death penalty. What frustrated him most wasn't that he was going to have to answer for his crimes, but that the men and women who were behind this sinister plot would probably get away with it. Martin was in a daze. His mind and body were numb as he stood there listening to everything. Then the judge asked him a question. He had to have her repeat it because he hadn't heard it the first time. The continued guilty verdicts were like blows to his gut, knocking the wind out of him with each one. "Mr. Martin Brown, do you have anything to say before I issue my sentencing?" asked Judge Lake. He didn't want to look weak, but he knew there wasn't anything he could say or do to save his own life. Still, he felt compelled to say something. "I was an unwitting pawn, and what we have all come to see was a global conspiracy," he explained. "I do not disagree with the verdicts. I did those things. I did those things believing I was doing the right thing for my country. I did those things because I truly felt the president was an illegitimate dictator and needed to be stopped. For years, that had been pounded into my brain. While I'm not dismissing my own crimes, I do hope that the individuals who started this and the other groups that perpetuated it will one day also be held accountable. The judge nodded. Mr. Martin Brown, while I do not hold you accountable for the actions that led our country into this second civil war and subsequent invasion, I do hold you accountable for your own actions in it. You knowingly committed treason and took up arms against your country. Worse, you killed at least 14 U.S. soldiers, people who are sworn to protect our country from this very type of threat. She paused for a moment, collecting her own thoughts before she continued. Taking all of these things into consideration, you are hereby sentenced to death by firing squad. You will be executed in 4 days. You will be afforded some time to work with your lawyer to sort your affairs, such as they are. Phone privileges will be granted to you to allow you to say your final goodbyes to your family, which is something the soldiers you killed were not afforded. I hope this public trial and your public execution will serve as a deterrent to others who may consider taking up arms against our country. It will not be tolerated.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.